laptop. I'll try again. Yep, there it is.
Yeah. Now.
Okay. Okay. This is largely a summary, and in some ways I feel like I'm a bit of a fraud. I'll hopefully not speak for more than 15 to 20 minutes. I know, Dan, you've given me 15. I say it's a little bit of a fraud in that I don't really talk a lot about spirituality, but it's an important part of my reflection here, and it's part of a problem that I'm wrestling with. So hopefully, what I'm getting at will emerge. The importance of spirituality will emerge in what I have to say. Okay. So I'll begin with what some of the other speakers have already more or less said something a little bit about. We seem to be living in a chaotic and irrational world. It seems to be, particularly in some parts of the Western world, a world which is dominated by Marxism, deconstruction, and critical theory. An important part of this, and it's been mentioned before, is the denial of truth. And we've had a little bit of a potted history of the last several hundred years of Western thought, where we've moved from a kind of certainty embodied within a religious context to a denial of that with the Enlightenment project, where reason alone was important. So God was shifted into the private sphere, and to more recently to post-modernity, which denies truth, where we have the idea that there are many truths, many ideas that can flourish. So it's really this notion of a denial of truth that is crucial here. And some of this arises, and I think the origin of postmodernism arises partly in the 19th century, and some of this will become apparent as I go along. So the death of the denial of truth is connected to the death of God. And as Nietzsche warns us, and many take him to claiming that God is dead, and he does say that, but what he adds, if you read the full quote, is, and we have killed him. But what he's warning against here is the consequences of this. And I think part of our chaotic, irrational world is the result, or the idea that God is no longer necessary. We've seen the emergence of critical theory, which is, a kind of Marxist development, a neo-Marxism, which divides the world into binaries. We have the oppressed, we have oppressors, we have black, we have white, we have non-racists, we have racists, and any other kinds of binaries you care to develop. And those who are on one side, namely oppressed, black, non-racists, and so on, are good. The rest are bad and evil. There is a kind of distinction. There's a self-hatred that we're being pushed to within the West, namely self-hatred of the West and Western values, and the glorification to some degree of other kinds of values, in particular the values of native peoples or indigenous peoples. And there is also then this notion of self-indulgence, as I'll come to a bit. Importantly, the rejection of reason and religion, and what this leads to, and if in the context of a spirituality, it kind of reduces spirituality by leaching religion out of it, or any notion of transcendence, into a kind of notion of mindfulness. All right, so that's a kind of bleak portrait, pessimistic portrait, you might say. Okay, so the transcendent God is rejected, but surprisingly Gnosticism reigns. And by Gnosticism, I mean the valoration of human consciousness. That is, we are human beings and we are defined by consciousness. Consciousness, as Judith Butler has shown in a number of her books, or argued in a number of her books, is defined by desire. So if we really think about this, how do we become self-conscious? We become conscious of wanting something. And so we're looking at what is perhaps understood as a first-person perspective. So subjects of desire, consciousness, we become conscious of desire and self-conscious through wanting to get what we desire. The subject becomes all important, and indeed it's the enactment of our desires which define who we are in that kind of Butlerian analysis in some of her books, Gender Troubles, for example, but over a successive books after that as well. Interestingly, she takes her first book, in fact, was a study of Hegel, but she takes Hegel in a direction which is anything but Hegelian. Okay, so where does this take me? Well, in the way in which I wanted to reflect on this, I thought, is this all new? Well, the interesting thing is that subjectivity is an ancient problem. If you go back to Plato, he discusses subjectivity in many of his dialogues. Now, I don't intend to try and trace all that and how he does it, but the reason why I think it's important to go back to some of these ancient sources, because it may give us some clues and some possible ways of handling this sort of turn to the subject and this denial of truth, and hence this kind of, if you like, kind of attenuation of what we might understand by spirituality. So if we think about some of the Plato's dialogues, the Republic, for example, considers the nature of justice. And in that, one of the key arguments that's presented is the idea that self-interests are going to trump being just. Why? Because the self-interested person will always come out on top. Why? Because they're self-interested. They're not going to be fair. They're no interest in being fair. They want to do better than just be fair. So that, of course, means the unjust person suffers. There is in that dialogue also the famous Ring of Gyges, in which where Plato says, supposing you could be invisible and get away with things, why wouldn't you? And wouldn't the just man be a fool if he simply stuck to his guns and tried to be just? So the Republic, whilst it comes down on the side of justice, does run that fairly strong argument about self-interest. And the notion of self-interest is a very common theme in our modern understandings of what is owed to us. I need people to pander to what I desire, in effect. There is that kind of selfishness. So self-interest is this turn to an inward turn. Theaetetus famously talks about Protagoras' statement that man is the measure. And what that means is that we are, if you like, the final arbiters of how things are. There is whatever it is that we say things are like, then that's the way they are, at least to us. So further on, of course, and what we'll talk about is the sophist challenge to the distinction between being and non-being. In particular, the sophist challenge is to deny the idea that there is anything such as falsehood, which means the denial of the idea that the non-being doesn't exist. So there is a problem here. So Plato's challenge is to somehow deal with this kind of this subjectivist turn, as we'll see. So he postulates the forms in order to deal with this, but I won't deal with the forms at all here. Okay, now why is this important? And it struck me that in the modern context, a lot of what George Orwell had to say in 1984 seems to be coming home to roost. The idea that reality is something objective, existing in its right. Well, I tell you, Winston, there is no such thing, according to the torturer of Winston. You've got to get rid of these 19th century ideas about the laws of nature. We make the laws of nature. The government makes the laws of nature. Mass media makes the laws of nature, or decides about what is actual and what is real. Nothing exists except human consciousness. Well, this idea, this assault, seems to me to be very much part of our present day context. All right, so one of the key elements in this is this question, what is a woman? Now, I don't know whether we got time to see this, but this is an interesting little video. It's of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who doesn't seem to have any idea. Now, maybe I don't have time to play this, but so I won't. I'll leave it for you to have a look at that. He says, how could you give this kind of question to me without notice? I need to be able to think about the answer to this. But the point here is no one seems to know anymore. So what's that saying to us? All right, so it seems to be that we have a whole lot of disagreements that are forbidden. There are many genders, men can have babies, white people are privileged, climate change deniers are evil, Trump voters are rednecks. You may, of course, agree with all of those things, and that's not my point. My point is that disagreements are forbidden. There is something taboo about disagreeing with certain kinds of views. Okay. Now, Plato's sophist is targeting the denial of falsehood, and he does this by considering the distinction between being and non-being. I don't have time to explore that, why that's important, but it's certainly going to be important if we're talking about the nature of truth. And if we're talking about the nature of truth, we're talking about about God, because God is truth. We talk about the heuristics. Who are they? They pursue verbal opposition. So these binaries, they make reasoning impossible because they either overuse language or they make it imprecise. They deny predication. They go from unity to plurality without passing through the intermediate changes. So they start with something being unified and then break it down. They refuse to, and similarly, they might go from plurality to unity. For instance, saying that we have a distinction between whites and non-whites, and so lumping all whites as being just a generic term that covers everybody. They refuse to attribute motional power to being. They're enemies of sense and not the friends of ideas. So the heuristics are people who like to argue for the sake of argument. So this investigation of being and non-being is directly linked to truth, and this modern privileging of the subject can be linked to Kant. Now, Husserl develops phenomenology. Why? To preserve the idea of objectivity. And so he kind of he takes Descartes seriously, the first person perspective, but he goes in a different direction. So just reminding ourselves about Descartes. The other thing that's crucial about understanding Descartes, it seems to me, is is that when he decides to find what he can know for certain, he ends up in a disembodied thinking consciousness, a disembodied thinking thing. Even my saying it's a thinking consciousness is an interpretation. The only way back for him is through God. So he has to find an externality, and the externality is through the trademark argument, which, if you might remember the meditation, is he rummages around. What else is there in my thinking thing? There is this trace of God. The other thing that we find is, if this is so, is that means there can't be any private knowledge. If, in other words, we depend upon getting back into the world in order to know anything, then, and for Descartes, the guarantee of the truth of what he finds was God, there can't be any private knowledge. It has to come from outside, and that is an important kind of counter to the idea that there can be there's any kind of truth, or there's anybody truth is, or opinion is as good as any other. Okay, so the other thing about this, of course, is that it's paradoxically the denial of falsity jeopardizes the very binaries on which the kind of ideologue, or the postmodern Marxist ideologue, seems to depend. If you can't say what a woman is, then it's either because you don't know what the English word means, know the word but don't know what it refers to. That is, it might not have a referent, of course. So the third thing is know the word but not know what it means. Fourthly, deny that there are any objects that can be so described. And fifthly, assert that there's no prescriptive definition and means or refers to whatever the subject takes it to refer to or mean. It's a denial. The other term that's often used, denial of any essentialism. So, okay, so to say something about being and non-being, to know what is beautiful, to look at their connection, and this is where you get this idea that non-being has an existence of some kind. We also know what is not beautiful. So if we claim we know what is beautiful, then we know the opposite. To know what is just, we know what is unjust. If we know what being is, we also know what non-being is. Now, if that's so, for the non-being, it means non-being has a being, and for the conclusion is there can be no falsehood, because non-being itself has an existence. So the challenge is to say in what sense it has this being. So the dialectical method that Plato uses is a bit similar to Hegel. That's an overstatement, not quite true, but there are some similarities. But because it involves a kind of successive postulation of dichotomies, which eventually provide a satisfactory definition. And Plato himself gives this example of angling, and he makes various comparisons. Is this about an animal that's on the land or in the water? Is it an animal that's on the water or in the water, and so on? And so eventually, is it done by nets or is it done by spearing? How is it carried out? And eventually he gets to what angling consists in, using a rod and reel. Okay, so the sophist, in a similar way, is unmasked. What does the sophist do? Trades in knowledge, claims to know what virtue is an expert in debate and heuristic argument, uses words to beguile people. So this is summarising the argument in a very, very quick way. So when we think about being, there are two things we can say about non-being. Is a species of being, since we can talk about it. And of course, jumping to modern kinds of ways of dealing with non-being, we have ways of dealing with this in set theory. But here in Plato, he talks about being and non-being, and that non-being has a certain sense, and it has a certain sense through the use of language and the use of words. So he makes the distinction between being and non-being by talking about, well, how we define being. And being is defined as being able to act on something and being able to be acted upon. And so it can be something other than change, or something other than change or rest. The other thing that it is that it need not have, it can't be just a physical kind of thing. So a soul can have being. But again, there needs to be further detail for that. Okay, but the point is we can distinguish being and non-being. Non-being is something we can talk about. Now, Plato isn't able to, doesn't have the modern sense of this, but he certainly thinks you can make a distinction between the two through defining being itself. But being able to talk about non-being doesn't make it have a kind of being in the same way that being has. So nevertheless, it has a being, therefore. Okay, so there is falsehood. Since we can distinguish being and non-being, we can say that the sophist is wrong to propose there is no falsehood. Why? Because non-being has a kind of species of being. So has a form of being, and we cannot say that it exists, but what it is not so we can say that it is what it is not in a certain sense. So falsehood involves not only what is false, but a misuse of words. So there's a bit more argument to be had around that. So the sophist and the Marxist ideologue are cut from the same cloth, it seems to me. And so I'll just simply conclude by saying that the modern zeitgeist rejection of truth is shown to be sophistical. And so we need to heed Orwell's warning. What's this got to do with spirituality? Well, it is anchored in the notion of truth, because truth is connected to God, and without a sense of God, there is really no spirituality. But of course, that needs further argument. I'll stop there.